The moment Lady Celia Ashford heard her name erupt across the ballroom in a tone sharp enough to slice silk, she knew, instantly, instinctively, with a cold certainty that hollowed her chest, that her life was about to be destroyed. For the footman stumbling toward her, clutching a crumpled letter, might as well have been carrying the blade meant to sever her future, and as he thrust the damning page forward, the chandeliers above seemed to tremble with the shock wave of scandal detonating at her feet. She felt the air shift, as whispers rippled outward like cracks on glass, each one widening the fracture in her reputation, and before she could draw a steady breath, a man she had never spoken to seized her wrist and pulled her into a staged embrace so sudden, so intimate, so indecent, that the watching crowd gasped as one. Celia jerked away in horror, but the damage was instant and irreversible. The forged letter in the footman's hand bore her handwriting, the stranger's proximity implied her desperation, and the ton, ever hungry for blood, devoured the spectacle with savage delight. She saw familiar faces twist into masks of revulsion and pity, saw matrons draw their daughters closer as though she carried a contagion, saw young men who once bowed eagerly now look upon her as though she had orchestrated her own downfall for attention. Inside her, something fragile broke with an ache so sharp it nearly stole her breath, yet the ballroom did not pause to see it, for the music faltered, the dancers hesitated, and the hostess murmured frantically to her husband, while Celia's vision blurred around the edges, the room tilting in a dizzying swirl of humiliation. She forced her trembling legs to carry her backward, needing escape, air, anything to stop the roaring in her ears. But even as she fled, she felt a gaze upon her, not mocking, not condemning, but cold, fierce, and unsettlingly intent. High above, half veiled in the shadows of a balcony, the Duke of Ravenscar watched her destruction unfold with a stillness that made him seem carved from stone, yet the tension in his stance revealed something dangerously human beneath the legend, something like recognition or warning or unwanted concern. Celia did not see his jaw clench or the way his eyes tracked her every step. She felt only the crushing weight of disgrace suffocating the edges of her world. When she burst through the ballroom doors and stumbled into the freezing night, the sudden quiet struck her like a blow, the cold air burning her lungs as she pressed a shaking hand to her chest, fighting the instinct to collapse. She thought the night had taken everything, her reputation, her future, her safety within society's walls. What she did not know, what no one yet understood, was that her ruin had just been witnessed by the one man who had sworn never to involve himself in another's fate again, and that he would not, could not, forget the sight of her devastation. Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ravenscar, rode home from the Haraway ball with the image of Celia Ashford's devastation burning behind his eyes like a phantom he could not blink away. And though he tried, truly tried, to bury it beneath the iron discipline that had ruled his life since childhood, the memory clung to him with unnerving persistence, as if her humiliation had lodged a splinter beneath his ribs. The carriage wheels rattled over the cobblestones, but the sound did nothing to drown out the echo of her breath, hitching when the forged letter appeared, nor the tremor in her hands when the stranger touched her without permission, nor the look, oh, that look, of stunned, raw disbelief on her face as she stumbled from the ballroom as though the very air had turned against her. He cursed softly under his breath, furious with himself for caring, for letting the chaos of a woman's ruin disturb a vow he had carved into his bones. Never again would he allow his life to be entangled with that volatile, treacherous creature called affection. He had seen what love did to a man. He had watched it unravel his father until there was nothing left but a hollowed shell and a young boy forced to inherit the debris. From that moment, Adrian had forged himself into a fortress, cold, controlled, immune. And yet, the sight of Celia Ashford's trembling retreat had struck him with a force he had not anticipated, awakening a protective instinct he despised for its familiarity, its echo of everything he vowed to suffocate. By the time he reached Ravenscar Manor, a storm churned behind his stern expression, unseen but palpable to those who knew him well. He paced his study, the lamplight casting sharp lines across the room as he replayed the incident, searching for logic where emotion had no place. The scandal had unfolded too neatly, too quickly, with precision that suggested intention rather than indiscretion. The stranger's conveniently timed appearance, the letter appearing at the exact moment she stepped into the ballroom center, all of it stank of orchestration. Adrian did not know Celia, had exchanged no more than a polite nod with her at past gatherings, Yet something in her wide-eyed shock told him she was no architect of her own ruin. It was the helplessness in her posture that haunted him, a helplessness he recognized only because he had once felt it himself. With a frustrated sigh, he summoned a loyal footman and gave an instruction he immediately regretted, and yet could not retract, to discreetly confirm that Lady Ashford had reached her residence safely. He told himself the order was motivated by propriety, by the bare minimum expected of a duke who had witnessed injustice, but the truth settled heavily in his chest. Some part of him had already begun to circle her like a shield, unbidden and unwanted, and as he finally sank into the leather chair beside the hearth, staring into the dying embers, he realized with a cold, unwelcome clarity that the vow he lived by had shifted, even if only by a fraction. All because of the frightened, ruined young woman who had fled the ballroom as though the world itself had turned on her. Celia's exile unfolded with the quiet cruelty of something that pretended to be mercy, for her mother insisted it was for her own good, the tongue whispered it was absolutely necessary, and Celia herself, numb and hollow from the collapse of her life, could summon neither protest nor hope as she was packed into a modest carriage before dawn and sent away from London with only 2 trunks and the brittle fragments of the future she once imagined she might have. The countryside greeted her not with comfort, but with a cold, indifferent mist that clung to her skin as she stepped onto the overgrown path, leading to her Aunt Margaret's once grand, now weary estate, a place where ivy choked the stone walls and the windows seemed to sigh beneath decades of neglect. Yet her aunt welcomed her with teary eyes and fiercely protective arms, offering warmth where the world had offered only judgment, and for the first time since the night of the ball Celia felt the faintest flicker of safety, fragile, trembling, but real enough that her lungs finally loosened around it. Still, she could not pretend the shame wasn't there, coiled tightly around her ribs, nor that each morning she didn't wake with the stab of forgetting before the memory crashed back over her in a wave so sharp she almost flinched. She spent hours wandering the quiet rooms and wilted gardens, unable to escape the haunting question of how a single moment could unmake an entire life. Yet life, stubborn and indifferent to despair, kept moving around her, weeds pushing through soil, distant birds calling across the fields, her aunt humming softly as she mended linens. Eventually Celia found herself drawn to the garden, its unruly sprawl mirroring the tangle of her own thoughts, and with tentative hands she began pulling away dead stems, trimming wild branches, coaxing life back into corners where it had long been forgotten. There was solace in the earth, small, temporary, but hers, and as days slipped by, her cheeks warmed again with sun, not shame, her silence filled with focus rather than dread. But peace never arrived without shadow, for each time a carriage passed on the distant road her heart seized with fear that someone from London had come to gawk, or worse, to announce some fresh cruelty born from her ruin. Meanwhile, miles away in Ravenscar Manor, Adrian Blackwell received word of her retreat and found himself unsettled in a way he could not rationalize, pacing before the hearth as he reread the brief report stating she appeared safe, though withdrawn, words that should have satisfied him yet left an ache lodged behind his stern composure. He told himself it was the unnatural neatness of the scandal that lingered in his thoughts, nothing more. He told himself no woman, ruined or otherwise, held claim over his attention. And yet, as he stared into the crackling fire that evening, he felt a pull toward the quiet countryside he could not explain, a pull strong enough that by morning he had already decided on a reason, or rather an excuse, to travel there. Celia, tending to the softened earth beneath her fingertips, had no idea her solitude was about to be broken by the very man who refused to forget her. Adrian Blackwell arrived at the countryside under the guise of inspecting a neighboring estate, a justification he repeated with such clipped precision that even he nearly believed it, though the truth pressed uncomfortably beneath the layers of his self-control. He had come because the memory of Celia Ashford's trembling dignity would not release him, haunting his thoughts with a persistence he deeply resented. The morning air was crisp as he dismounted near the border of her aunt's land, the quiet fields stretching wide beneath a pale sky, and as he walked the narrow path that wound through the property, he told himself he would merely observe, satisfy his curiosity, and leave before anyone realized he had been there. Yet fate, or something far more dangerous, carried him toward the garden where Celia knelt in the soft earth, sleeves rolled up, tendrils of hair escaping her pins as she coaxed life from a bed of faded roses. She did not hear him at first, too absorbed in her careful work, and Adrian found himself pausing, arrested by the quiet determination etched into her posture, by the way humility and strength seemed to coexist within her so naturally that it struck him like a revelation. Gone was the delicate debutante crushed beneath society's scorn. Here stood a woman reshaping the small world around her with gentle, resolute hands. When at last she sensed his presence and looked up, her eyes widened in shock, and she stumbled to her feet, brushing soil from her palms as though trying to erase any trace of the life she had been forced into. Her voice wavered with wary politeness as she greeted him, confusion mingling with the instinctive fear of yet another judgment, and Adrian felt an unexpected tightening in his chest at the sight of her flushed cheeks and guarded expression. He offered some half-formed explanation about business and passing through, though his tone lacked its usual effortless authority, and Celia, though unconvinced, nodded because she had spent years learning that questioning powerful men rarely served her. The silence that followed crackled with an unnamed tension, her eyes darting to the abandoned pruning shears, as if the simplicity of the garden work anchored her more than the presence of a duke ever could. Adrian, unused to discomfort of any kind, felt oddly unmoored, struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the shattered figure he had seen flee the ballroom. She apologized for her appearance, cheeks coloring, but he dismissed it with a quiet brusqueness that was more sincerity than courtesy, telling her she looked perfectly appropriate for tending to the land. The compliment startled her enough that she glanced away, pressing a hand lightly to her apron, as though unsure what to do with the warmth rising within her. For a moment, neither moved, the air between them swelling with something fragile and unspoken, and Adrian knew with a sinking certainty that whatever had drawn him here was not curiosity. It was something far more treacherous, something that tightened around him like a binding he could not break, even as he forced himself to turn away with a stiffness that betrayed his reluctance. Celia remained in the garden long after he disappeared down the path, her pulse unsteady and her thoughts spinning, wondering why a man who had sworn himself untouched by sentiment would travel miles to stand before her like that, and fearing, quietly, dangerously, what it might mean for both of them. The storm swept in with startling speed that afternoon, darkening the sky before Celia had even finished trimming the last of the garden's stubborn branches, and though she tried to hurry inside, the rain broke open in a roaring sheet that left her scrambling toward the nearest shelter, the old greenhouse at the edge of the estate, its glass panes mottled with age and its hinges groaning as she shoved the door closed behind her. She leaned against the damp wood, breath unsteady, skirts clinging to her legs, and had only begun to gather herself when the door jolted again and swung inward to admit a figure she recognized instantly, despite the blur of rain. Adrian Blackwell, drenched from head to boots, his dark hair plastered against his brow, his usually pristine composure replaced by something startlingly human as he stepped inside and dragged the door shut behind him. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, both caught off guard by the intimate absurdity of sharing such a confined space, and Celia felt heat rush to her cheeks as she murmured a flustered apology for occupying the only shelter in sight, though it was clear the apology was unnecessary. The Duke looked far more unsettled than she. The storm hammered against the glass, rattling the old structure as if eager to force them closer, and Adrian, attempting to shake off the tension, removed his gloves with a restraint that looked more like distraction than propriety, his gaze flicking toward her with a quiet intensity that sent a tremor through her chest. She tried to compose herself, smoothing her damp skirts, but the closeness made her hyper-aware of everything, the faint scent of wet earth, the cold air trapped between the panes, the way Adrian stood too near and yet not near enough. Polite conversation faltered in her throat, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, asking whether she often tended the garden in such weather. She managed a nervous laugh, admitting she had misjudged the sky, and his answering smile, brief, rare, and painfully gentle, felt like a secret meant only for her. The quiet between them grew warm, almost fragile, as they spoke of small things that somehow carried the weight of deeper meaning, the peace of solitude, the ache of isolation, the strange comfort found in creating order from chaos. Celia felt her guard slipping, not because she trusted easily, but because Adrian listened with an attentiveness she had never known from someone of his rank, as though her thoughts were not burdens but truths he wished to keep. And he, who had mastered the art of emotional distance, found himself revealing small fragments of vulnerability, Nothing overt, nothing dangerous, yet enough to make his voice falter when he admitted he rarely stood still long enough to hear his own thoughts. When the rain finally softened, neither moved to open the door, both lingering in the greenhouse as if stepping outside would break something delicate. And though neither spoke the realization aloud, both felt it. The storm had trapped them together, but something deeper had begun to bind them long before the first drop fell. Celia awoke the morning after the storm with a strange ache in her chest, the kind that felt suspiciously like hope, yet carried enough uncertainty to make her wish she could tuck it away with her folded handkerchiefs. For every time she thought of Adrian Blackwell standing in the greenhouse, drenched, patient, unexpectedly gentle, her breath snagged in a way that frightened her almost as much as it warmed her. She tried to bury herself in garden work again, determined to convince herself that nothing meaningful had passed between them, but her thoughts betrayed her with every clipped branch and turned patch of soil, slipping back to the memory of his quiet laughter and the soft warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, as though she were not a ruined woman but someone worth seeing. Meanwhile, miles away at Ravenscar Manor, Adrian wrestled with the consequences of his own impulses, pacing before the massive windows as he replayed their conversation in the greenhouse, irritated with himself for lingering on the sound of her voice, the tremor in her hands, the admirable strength she tried so hard to hide beneath modest humility. By midday he had done something wildly out of character. He drafted a private invitation addressed to Celia and her aunt, requesting her presence at a small, intentionally discreet gathering, a gathering designed with ruthless precision to be free of gossiping tongues, a place where she might step back toward society without the cruelty of full exposure. He sealed the letter before he could reconsider, though the moment the wax hardened he felt an unfamiliar heaviness press against his ribs, as if he had crossed yet another invisible line he once swore never to approach. When Celia received the Duke's letter, she nearly dropped it, her heart lurching with a mixture of dread and longing so intense she had to sit before her knees gave way. The idea of returning to society, even in a limited, protected setting, sent icy panic through her, for she could still feel the echo of that ballroom humiliation like a bruise beneath her skin. She imagined whispers resurfacing, imagined curious stares probing her like blades, imagined becoming once again the spectacle she had barely survived. Her aunt, seeing her distress, took her hand and urged her to read the letter again, reminding her gently that a life lived entirely in hiding was no life at all, that Celia deserved the chance to reclaim the world that had cast her aside. Yet Celia could not ignore the deeper confusion stirring within her. Why would a man like the Duke of Ravenscar expend even a measure of effort on her behalf, especially when he had nothing to gain and everything, in reputation and precedent, to lose? She whispered a trembling refusal, though the words tasted wrong the moment they left her lips, lingering like a swallowed fragment that refused to settle. And as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, she found herself wondering, against reason, against self-preservation, whether turning away from the one person who seemed to believe she deserved more was an act of caution or cowardice. Adrian had expected Celia's refusal. He told himself as much the moment her polite decline arrived at Ravenscar Manor, but the truth settled into him with a bitterness he could neither ignore nor reason away, for her rejection did not soothe the discomfort of his growing attachment as he hoped it might. Instead, it sharpened something dangerous inside him, something protective and unyielding, pushing him toward a path he had no desire to walk. He stood alone in his study, the letter crumpled slightly from the pressure of his grip, and stared at the inked words that thanked him for his kindness, yet gently insisted that she could not risk stepping into society again. To any other man, such a refusal would have been the end of it, but Adrian felt a tightening in his chest that was as unwelcome as it was undeniable, urging him not to retreat but to act. He set the letter aside and turned toward the desk where the documents regarding her scandal were laid out, each piece of evidence staring back at him like taunts demanding resolution. With a low, frustrated breath, he began to examine the forged letter again, tracing each loop of imitation handwriting as a hunter might study the tracks of a predator. Something about the script bothered him, a precision that felt practiced, a confidence that implied intent rather than desperation. The stranger at the ball, too, haunted his thoughts, a man conveniently placed, conveniently timed, conveniently forgettable. Adrian summoned one of his most trusted men, a discreet investigator loyal to the Ravenscar name, and issued orders to track down the stranger's identity, movements, and associations. He told himself this was simply a matter of uncovering the truth, a logical continuation of his own suspicions, not an act of emotional entanglement. But when his servant hesitated, asking whether this was truly necessary, Adrian's sharp "yes" rang out with far more force than intended. Meanwhile, in the countryside, Celia made every attempt to steady her mind after sending her refusal, but Adrian's invitation lingered like a warm echo, gently pressuring the parts of her heart she had learned to keep silent. She tried to distract herself with garden work and household tasks, yet nothing dulled the memory of the Duke's quiet intensity in the greenhouse, nor the strange sense of safety she had felt despite their limited acquaintance. When her aunt gently suggested that she might have declined too quickly, Celia insisted her decision was necessary. Though her voice wavered with uncertainty, she could not hide. But she had no time to dwell on the Duke's motives or her own confused emotions. For that evening, a carriage arrived at her aunt's estate, with a sealed note from London, another whisper of rumor, another reminder that the world had not forgotten her ruin. Celia felt dread twist in her stomach, but miles away Adrian felt something very different. He felt the first stirrings of righteous anger, a cold, piercing resolve rising within him as he vowed silently that whoever had orchestrated her destruction would not remain hidden in the shadows much longer. Celia had barely slept after receiving yet another reminder that London had not tired of picking apart the remnants of her reputation, and by morning her nerves were frayed in a way that made even the soft chirping of birds outside her window feel unbearably sharp. She tried to busy herself with tea preparation, with folding linens, with tending to the garden, but nothing quieted the restless ache inside her. Not fear exactly, but a hollow uncertainty that made her wish the world would simply leave her alone. So when another letter arrived from the Duke of Ravenscar, her breath caught painfully in her throat, for she expected a second invitation, a repeat of the one she had already refused. Instead, she found something far more impossible. Adrian's words were carefully measured, free of sentiment yet laden with quiet understanding, offering not another social gathering but a different kind of assistance entirely. He wished to teach her the subtleties of composure, the skills required to withstand scrutiny, the strategies used by those who navigate society from positions of strength rather than survival. Celia read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling each time she reached the line where he invited her, not as a pitiable outcast, not as a fragile burden, but as someone capable of standing tall again, if only she allowed herself the chance. Her aunt urged her to accept, insisting that learning such things was not an admission of weakness, but an act of reclaiming what had been stolen from her. Celia hesitated, torn between gratitude and fear, until at last a small, stubborn ember within her, a part of her that refused to die, pushed her to write a tentative acceptance. Adrian received her reply with a tension he refused to name, immediately making arrangements to visit the estate the following afternoon. When he arrived, the meeting began awkwardly, both of them unsure how to navigate the strange intimacy of a lesson that was part etiquette, part armor. He instructed her on how to hold her chin when facing the weight of a whispering crowd, how to maintain eye contact without challenge, how to use silence as strength rather than surrender. Celia absorbed every word, slowly straightening beneath his guidance, each correction easing away a fragment of the shame that had clung to her since the ball. And Adrian, who had spent years protecting himself from even the suggestion of emotional closeness, found himself growing increasingly unsettled by the sight of her resilience, by the quiet determination in her gaze as she repeated each exercise with unwavering focus. At moments, their hands brushed, unintentional, fleeting, and each time, a faint tremor passed between them like the echo of a truth neither dared acknowledge. By the time their lesson ended, Celia felt something she had not felt in weeks: strength. And Adrian, watching her from the doorway as she thanked him with a trembling but genuine smile, realized with a slow, inevitable dread that he was losing the battle against the one thing he feared most. He was beginning to care for her, deeply and irrevocably, in ways he no longer knew how to contain. Celia spent the day leading up to dinner at Ravenscar Manor in a state of anxious anticipation, so taut it felt like a thread, pulled dangerously close to snapping. For although her lessons with Adrian had begun to restore a fragile sense of steadiness within her, the thought of stepping into his world, even in the privacy of a small invitation, only dinner, sent a shiver of doubt through every soft part of her heart. Her aunt fussed over her hair and adjusted the pale gown Celia had chosen, reassuring her repeatedly that the Duke would not have extended such an invitation had he not believed she could withstand it. Yet as their carriage approached the towering stone facade of Ravenscar Manor, Celia's breath hitched, for the sheer scale of the estate, imposing, ancient, and dignified, seemed to echo the magnitude of the man who lived within its walls. Adrian greeted them personally, his expression softer than she expected, though still wrapped in the composed restraint that shielded much of who he was. Inside, the manor's candlelit halls glowed with a warmth that surprised her. She had expected cold grandeur, but instead she found subtle beauty, rich woods, thoughtful details, and an underlying quiet that suggested Adrian lived more among his thoughts than among company. At dinner, seated across from him at a modestly set table rather than the cavernous one she had imagined, Celia found her nerves slowly unraveling. Adrian spoke with a calm, steady tone, asking about her garden, her recovery, her comfort in the countryside, and although his questions were simple, the sincerity behind them made her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of gratitude and longing. As the conversation deepened, she noticed things she had never allowed herself to study before: the way his jaw tensed when he grew contemplative, the fleeting hint of sadness in his eyes when he spoke of his father, the gentleness he fought to conceal beneath every measured word. She realized, with a soft and startling ache, that the Duke was not merely a stern and distant figure, but a man carved from old wounds and quiet solitude. And Adrian, observing Celia across the table, felt the ground shift beneath him as he took in the delicate strength she carried so earnestly. The way she spoke carefully, yet with a sincerity that disarmed him, the bravery it took for her to be present after a world-shaking scandal, the grace she displayed even when uncertainty clouded her gaze. As the evening wore on, the two of them drifted from polite discourse into something more meaningful, sharing truths about loneliness, expectation, and the strange ways life could break a person and still leave them yearning to mend. When Celia rose to leave, Adrian walked her to the carriage, the silence between them charged with something fragile and unspoken. She dipped into a curtsy, murmuring her thanks, but he stopped her with her name spoken so softly it felt like a caress. In the faint glow of the manor's lanterns, something passed between them, an invisible tether drawing tight, leaving both with the undeniable sense that something irrevocable had shifted, even if neither dared reach for it yet. Rumors had a way of slithering through London like smoke, thin, poisonous, and nearly invisible until they curled themselves around the throats of their targets, and Celia discovered this bitter truth yet again when a courier arrived breathless at her aunt's estate, carrying a folded newspaper and a note marked only with a single initial she recognized with a jolt of dread. Lord Ensfield. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper and saw the inked whispers that danced across the columns, subtle insinuations, carefully crafted lines that suggested a fallen woman's conniving ambition, hints that her exile was not punishment but strategy, poisonously implying that she was now attempting to worm her way back into society through the pity of a powerful duke. Celia felt the strength she had slowly begun to rebuild turn brittle in her chest, cracking under the weight of humiliation she thought she had left behind. Her aunt tried to soothe her, insisting the Duke would never believe such cruelty, but that was not the point. Celia feared she was dragging Adrian into a darkness he had neither earned nor deserved. Meanwhile, in Ravenscar Manor, Adrian learned of the rumors not from the papers but from the two casual remarks of Parliament, men who smirked behind their glasses as they speculated about the Duke's sentimental entanglement with a ruined beauty. Their tone, laced with condescension and oily amusement, ignited a cold fury in him that startled even his closest adviser. Adrian had never been one to raise his voice or reveal emotion, yet this insult, this attack on Celia's character, on her worth, struck him in a place he had long believed numb. Without hesitation, he spoke with a cutting precision that silenced the room, reminding each man that a lady's honor was not a plaything for their amusement, and that anyone who dared repeat such slander would find themselves unwelcome in the circles of power they relied upon. His defense was sharp enough to leave marks, but Ensfield, hearing of Adrian's reaction through his network of opportunistic acquaintances, felt a surge of triumph rather than fear. If the Duke had become emotionally involved, then Ensfield knew exactly where to strike next. That evening, Celia sat alone in her room, clutching the newspaper as though it were a flame she could not extinguish, whispering into the quiet that she never wanted to bring harm to the man who had shown her nothing but dignity. And Adrian, pacing his study with restless steps, felt an unfamiliar pressure in his chest, an instinct to protect her, to shield her, to stand between her and every cruel tongue in London. The realization that he no longer wished to remain distant from her was both unwelcome and undeniable. Their paths were no longer parallel. They were converging, drawn together by forces neither fully understood. And lurking in the shadows, Ensfield watched their connection strengthen with a malevolent patience, ready to strike again now that he had identified the one weakness Adrian Blackwell had never accounted for, a woman he should never have allowed himself to care for. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, as though the sky itself recognized that Celia had reached the limit of what a heart could bear. Yet when Adrian arrived unannounced at her aunt's estate, with an urgency that pushed aside propriety, she found herself ushered into his carriage before she could fully protest, the determination in his eyes silencing every instinct of hesitation. He said little during the ride except that there was something she needed to see, something tied not to rumor or cruelty but to truth, real, tangible, undeniable truth. And though fear curled cold fingers along her spine, she followed him into the vast halls of Ravenscar Manor, her breath catching as he led her not to a sitting room or study, but to a narrow door hidden behind a tapestry. Inside lay a chamber she had never imagined existed. Shelves upon shelves of ledgers, correspondence, sealed records, and loose pages arranged with obsessive precision. The air smelled of parchment and ink, of secrets long kept and power quietly maintained. Adrian moved through the room with practiced familiarity, selecting several documents and spreading them across a long oak table before gesturing for her to join him. Celia hesitated, unsure why she belonged in a room where the Duke clearly conducted his most guarded affairs. But when he explained that these documents contained information about her scandal, something fragile inside her steadied. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edges of forged letters, suspicious transactions, and correspondences bearing Ensfield's seal. As Adrian talked her through each detail, she realized with dawning horror that someone had deliberately orchestrated her downfall, weaving lies with such meticulous care that the trap had sprung exactly as intended. Her throat tightened as she traced the familiar loops of handwriting that mimicked her own, so precise it made her stomach twist, while Adrian's voice, low and controlled, guided her through patterns she would have been too overwhelmed to notice alone. She asked questions with a tentative bravery, and each time Adrian answered with a steadiness that soothed, even as it disturbed her. They worked shoulder to shoulder, their heads bending close as they compared letters and dates, their hands brushing in small accidental moments that sent flickers of heat through the cool, dim room. Celia felt the weight of the evidence settling over her, not as another burden, but as the shocking promise of vindication. But what shook her more was the way Adrian studied her, not with pity but with a fierce, quiet respect, as though he had known all along that she was someone worth fighting for. Hours passed unnoticed, and somewhere between one document and the next, she realized that she no longer felt like a ruined woman cowering from the world. She felt like a partner standing beside the most formidable man in England, unraveling a conspiracy that had stolen her future. And Adrian, watching her determination sharpen into resolve, felt something shift inside him with a force that nearly unmoored him. Admiration, yes, but also the unmistakable pull of a connection he could no longer deny. Night had descended long before either Celia or Adrian realized how deeply they had sunk into their work, the ledger room illuminated only by the steady glow of 2 oil lamps, whose flickering light danced over their bent forms as they pored through document after document, shoulders occasionally brushing, breaths mingling in the narrow pockets of space between them. Hours slipped by unnoticed, the air thick with focused intensity and a quiet, unspoken closeness neither dared acknowledge. For Celia felt something warm and dizzying settle beneath her ribs each time Adrian leaned closer to trace a line of text, and Adrian felt the increasingly dangerous quickening of his pulse whenever her soft voice broke the silence with an astute observation. It was only when Celia reached to turn a page and her hand lightly grazed his that the moment cracked. They froze, eyes locking in the dim amber glow, their breaths stilled as though the entire room was holding itself perfectly still for them. But before either could speak, footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway, a servant on nightly rounds, and the fragile bubble of intimacy shattered. The ledger room door creaked open a mere inch, enough for a loyal but overly cautious footman to glimpse what he should never have seen. A duke and a disgraced young woman alone together at midnight, faces too close, the light casting shadows that suggested a closeness neither had yet acted upon. Celia gasped softly, pulling her hand back as though burned, her cheeks flushing with panicked heat. Adrian straightened sharply, his jaw tightening as he issued a curt, controlled dismissal that sent the startled servant scurrying away, but the damage was done. Celia's heart hammered in her chest, dread rising like a cold tide as she whispered that she should not have come, that she had invited disaster upon him simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong hour. Adrian crossed the space between them in 2 swift strides, his expression fierce with a conviction she had never seen from him before, insisting that she bore no fault, that he alone would shoulder any shadow cast upon this moment. His voice, low and rough with urgency, told her the truth she had been too frightened to believe, that he would rather be compromised himself than allow her to suffer another unjust blow to her reputation. The admission struck her with a force that left her breathless, her eyes stinging with emotion she struggled to contain, for the Duke, who had vowed never to risk his heart, was now risking far more for her. For a heartbeat they stood dangerously close, shadows merging on the stone floor, and something deep and inevitable pulled them toward one another, as though the scandal of proximity had ignited a spark neither could smother. Adrian's gaze dropped to her lips, his breath unsteady, and Celia felt her entire world teeter on the edge of something irreversible. But with visible effort, he tore himself back, the restraint in his posture trembling like a sword held in shaking hands, and he stepped away with a ragged breath as though distance was the only shield left to him. The room settled into aching silence, the closeness shattered, but not forgotten, and Celia realized with a trembling certainty that this moment, this almost kiss born of fear, longing, and impossible restraint, had changed everything between them, even if neither could yet speak the truth of it aloud. The following afternoon, after a night spent wrestling with thoughts that left him more exhausted than any political battle ever had, Adrian summoned the resolve to seek Celia out again, not in the ledger room, where shadows clung too closely to the memory of their almost kiss, but outdoors where the cool air and open sky might grant him enough distance to maintain the control he felt slipping through his fingers. Celia agreed to walk with him through the sprawling gardens behind Ravenscar Manor, though her heart trembled with every step, for she could still feel the ghost of last night, the charged silence, the tremulous breath between them, the way he had looked at her as though the world had narrowed to the shape of her lips. They walked in companionable quiet at first, weaving between sculpted hedges and stone pathways glittering with morning dew, until Adrian stopped near an ancient oak tree whose branches bowed like guardians over the land. He drew a slow breath, and for the first time since she had met him, Celia sensed that he was unsettled not by anger or duty but by something achingly vulnerable. He told her, in a voice stripped of its usual composed authority, that there was a truth he needed to share before they ventured any further into dangers neither had chosen. He had not sworn off marriage because of indifference or superiority, but because he had witnessed love turn monstrous, watched it carve a wound so deep into his childhood that he had spent years trying to bury the scar beneath duty and solitude. Celia listened, her breath caught in her throat, as Adrian spoke of his mother's betrayal, how she had given her heart to another man, planning to flee in the night and abandon her family, how Adrian's father, a man of fierce devotion, had discovered the truth and confronted her, only to collapse under the weight of her rejection, his health unraveling until his death months later. Adrian had been only a boy, old enough to understand the pain etched into his father's face, yet helpless to stop the slow, consuming destruction that followed. From that moment, he told her, love became synonymous with ruin, trust became a luxury he refused to afford anyone, and marriage became a battlefield he vowed never to enter. As he spoke, Celia felt something inside her crack open, an ache of compassion so deep it threatened to unbalance her, for she had seen his strength, his command, his unshakable composure, but never imagined the lonely foundation upon which all of it had been built. She reached toward him without fully thinking, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand, a touch so gentle it might have been mistaken for a breeze, yet it struck him with the force of an unspoken promise. Adrian exhaled shakily, his gaze dropping to their intertwined shadows on the grass, as though afraid to meet the sincerity in her eyes. And in that quiet, trembling moment beneath the sheltering oak, Celia realized that the man the world saw as unbreakable was held together by careful restraint and old wounds, and Adrian realized that somehow, impossibly, she had become the one person capable of reaching through the armor he had spent a lifetime forging. The quiet peace that had settled between them beneath the sheltering oak did not survive the night, for when Celia returned to her aunt's estate at dusk, cheeks still warm from the fragile intimacy she and Adrian had shared, she found an envelope slipped beneath her bedroom door, plain, unsealed, and bearing no name. The moment her fingers touched it, a chill skittered down her spine, and when she unfolded the single sheet of parchment, the words within struck her with the cold precision of a knife. Cease your visits, cease your involvement, or the next blow will not be aimed at your reputation, but at everything you hold dear. There was no signature, yet the cruelty in the handwriting was unmistakable, smooth, practiced strokes that seemed almost smug in their threat. Celia's breath caught in her chest, panic clutching her throat as she sank onto the edge of her bed, the letter trembling in her hands. The room felt smaller, darker, as though the very walls were closing in around her. Her aunt rushed in moments later, alerted by the sound of something falling, Celia's candlestick, knocked over by her shaking knee, and when she saw the letter, her face drained of color. Celia could barely speak, her voice trapped somewhere beneath fear and disbelief, but she managed to whisper the name that both of them knew had penned those words, even without ink to confirm it: Ensfield. Her aunt insisted they go to Adrian at once, but Celia refused with a desperation that frightened them both. She could not involve him further, not when every step she took toward healing seemed to pull him deeper into danger. She paced the room with frantic, uneven breaths, torn between terror and a fierce, protective instinct she had never expected to feel toward the Duke of Ravenscar. Meanwhile, at Ravenscar Manor, Adrian sensed something wrong long before he received the hurried message from her aunt's coachman. He abandoned his evening meeting without explanation, striding through the shadows of the estate with a fear he had not felt in decades, a fear that settled like a stone in his chest as he rode toward Celia's home, with a speed that blurred the night around him. When he arrived, Celia tried to hide the letter, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. Adrian took the parchment with a controlled, deadly calm, his jaw tightening with every line he read, and when he looked up, the fury in his eyes was not loud or wild but cold, so cold it could have frozen the air between them. He insisted she stay at Ravenscar Manor under his protection until the threat was resolved, but Celia recoiled, shaking her head violently, insisting she would not be the cause of danger to him or to anyone. Their voices rose, not in anger toward each other but in desperation rooted in fear, her begging him not to risk himself for her, him refusing to let her face this alone. The tension snapped only when he caught her shoulders gently yet firmly, his voice dropping to a trembling whisper as he said her name with an urgency that made her eyes sting. In that moment, they stood locked together in fear, and something dangerously close to love, each terrified not for themselves but for the other, each knowing the threat had pushed them past a point where retreat was no longer possible. The storm of fear and anger that had erupted between them did not disperse when Celia and Adrian returned to Ravenscar Manor that night. Instead, it simmered beneath their every breath, a fragile, trembling force that followed them like a shadow into the quiet refuge of the ledger room, where Adrian insisted they continue their investigation despite the late hour. Celia's hands still shook from the threat she had received, her nerves raw, her heart pounding too near the surface, and though she tried to steady herself by focusing on the document spread before them, the warmth of the fire and the intensity of Adrian's presence set her pulse racing in ways she could neither control nor comprehend. Adrian kept his gaze fixed on the papers at first, but his attention drifted again and again to the way the firelight caught in her hair, to the slight tremor in her fingers, to the exhaustion she tried valiantly to hide. Finally, with a restraint that frayed visibly at the edges, he stepped closer and took the letter from her hand, his voice low and fierce as he told her she would not face threats alone, not while he still drew breath. His certainty shook her more than the threat had. Celia's composure collapsed in a quiet, trembling confession. She whispered that she feared she was ruining his life, that her presence near him had only invited darkness, that she wished she had never set foot in the ballroom that night, because it had brought him nothing but trouble. Her voice cracked, tears spilling before she could stop them, and Adrian froze, struck by the sight of her unraveling with such quiet pain. For a heartbeat he fought the instinct to touch her, to comfort her, to pull her into his arms, but the battle was brief, and he lost it utterly. He reached out, brushing his thumb along her cheek to catch a tear before it fell, the gesture so tender it hollowed something inside both of them. Celia's breath hitched, her lashes fluttering as though the gentleness hurt more than cruelty ever had. Adrian whispered her name in a tone laced with longing and restraint, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him, and when she lifted her gaze to his, the air between them tightened to a single trembling thread. He leaned in, slowly, as though pulled by a force beyond reason, his breath warm against her skin, his eyes dark with a confession he had never spoken aloud. Celia felt her heart surge upward, her entire being tilting toward him in a silent plea as her lips parted with the faintest whisper of his name. The distance between them narrowed to nothingness, and for a single, suspended moment it seemed inevitable that he would kiss her, inevitable that all the longing and fear and aching tenderness would finally break open between them. But at the last possible second, he stopped, his forehead resting lightly against hers as he exhaled a ragged breath, his hands trembling where they cupped her face. "I cannot," he murmured, though the words shook with the weight of a lie he no longer knew how to hold. Celia closed her eyes, torn between relief and heartbreak, feeling the unspoken truth thrum between them like a held note. He wanted her, needed her, more deeply than he dared admit. And as the fire crackled behind them, casting golden shadows across the ledger room, they remained frozen in the tenderness of a confession almost spoken, bound by a love neither yet dared to claim. The next morning should have offered Celia a moment of calm after the night's tender turmoil, but peace was a luxury society had no intention of granting her, for by the time Adrian joined her for breakfast in one of Ravenscar Manor's sunlit corridors, the first wave of fresh whispers had already reached him, cruel, insidious murmurs spreading through London like wildfire, twisting their midnight investigation into something sordid. Celia noticed the tension in his posture long before he spoke. The normally unshakable Duke stood rigid, his jaw clenched, a newspaper crushed in his fist, as though he had been tempted to tear it to shreds. When he finally handed it to her, she felt a sickening chill sweep through her as she scanned the familiar venom of society's gossip. Insinuations that she had maneuvered her way into the Duke's private chambers at inappropriate hours, that her strategic frailty had begun to soften Ravenscar's legendary resolve, that she was using her ruin as leverage to ensnare a man who had vowed never to wed. With each line, her breath grew tighter, her chest hollowing until she could hardly stand, for this was not the wide, faceless judgment of the ball. This was a targeted assault, sharpened by Ensfield's malice and amplified by those who delighted in resurrecting her suffering. Adrian watched her trembling hands with a look that was equal parts fury and heartbreak, and though he longed to pull her into his arms, he restrained himself, knowing too many shadows already clung to their closeness. Instead, he ordered his carriage and rode into the heart of London with a purpose that burned like icy fire under his ribs. In the gentlemen's club where political alliances were forged and destroyed over brandy, he found the very men who had been amplifying Ensfield's rumors, men who smirked behind polished glasses and spoke of Celia as though she were an amusing scandal rather than a woman fighting to rebuild her life. Adrian's entrance silenced the room, but the silence only stoked his anger. He spoke not with raised voice but with a cold, devastating precision that made even seasoned politicians flinch, reminding them that a lady's honor was not entertainment, that their cowardly gossip betrayed the very standards they claimed to uphold, and that anyone who dared speak Celia's name with anything less than respect would find themselves excluded from the dukedom's support. The room, once smug, shifted to unease. Yet for every man he froze with warning, another lurked ready to carry Ensfield's poison further. Back at Ravenscar Manor, Celia paced the drawing room with frantic steps, her thoughts spiraling into a storm of guilt and dread. She had wanted to reclaim dignity, not cost Adrian his own. And when he finally returned, the stark exhaustion in his eyes crushed her. He had defended her publicly, openly, something she had never imagined a man in his position would risk. She whispered that she was ruining him, that he needed only to distance himself to put an end to the gossip, but Adrian stepped toward her with a gravity that halted her words. He told her, voice low and unwavering, that letting go of her was the one thing he could not do, not now, not after everything he had witnessed, not after the truth he was only beginning to understand. And though Celia tried to argue, her resolve faltered when she saw the raw sincerity in his gaze, a sincerity that frightened her more deeply than any rumor, because she sensed that the next time her name fell upon society's lips, Adrian would not stand apart. He would stand beside her, no matter the cost. Adrian had long been accustomed to moving through the corridors of power with unshakable precision, the kind of controlled detachment that made him untouchable in Parliament and impervious to political maneuvers. Yet in the days following his public defense of Celia, he found that distance eroding as enemies he had kept at bay began to circle with renewed interest, sensing that the Iron Duke, unbending, unreachable, unreadable, had finally revealed a vulnerability. Lord Branton, a rival who had spent years attempting to undermine Adrian's influence in matters of trade reform, was the first to strike, his voice dripping with false concern as he suggested that Adrian's recent emotional entanglements were clouding his judgment. Others followed, men who had always been cautious in their opposition but now saw an opening, weaving insinuations about Adrian's competence, questioning his focus, and hinting that his alignment with a woman of scandal threatened the dignity of his office. Adrian met these underhanded remarks with icy composure, but inside he felt a cold fury simmer, not for himself but for Celia, who became the unwitting target in a game she had never chosen to play. Reports filtered back to him through trusted allies. Ensfield was fanning the flame of gossip with a strategic brilliance that made the Duke's jaw clench, orchestrating gatherings where Celia's name was tossed about like a cautionary metaphor, exploiting every small detail he could twist to his advantage. Meanwhile, Celia, unaware of the full depth of the political backlash, sensed only the tension in Adrian's shoulders each time he returned from London, the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the clipped tone he tried unsuccessfully to soften when he spoke to her. It was not hard for her to imagine the truth. She was a liability, a dangerous one. She saw the way servants hesitated before announcing her name, the way guests lowered their voices when she entered a room, and though Adrian tried to shield her from the worst of the whispers, he could not shield her from the quiet, insidious doubt that returned to gnaw at her heart. Late one evening, Celia overheard members of Adrian's council speaking outside the study, their voices dripping with barely concealed disdain as they questioned the wisdom of the Duke's involvement with a woman whose reputation had already proven fragile. The words pierced her with humiliating clarity. She sank behind a column, swallowing a sob that tasted of shame and self-loathing. When Adrian found her minutes later, her forced smile nearly broke him. She insisted she was fine, that she understood his responsibilities, that she appreciated every kindness he had shown her, but he heard the tremor beneath each word, the tremor of a woman trying to shrink herself to ease a burden she should never have had to carry. Adrian wanted to take her hands, to promise that none of this mattered as much as she did, but the weight of the political storm swirling around them pressed the words back down his throat. And as he watched her retreat to her room, shoulders curved inward with a familiar grief, he realized that the threat against Celia was no longer merely social. His enemies were using her to strike at him, and he would either protect her with everything he possessed, or risk losing not only the woman he increasingly loved, but the last fragile pieces of trust still holding her together. Celia had always believed there were different kinds of pain, the sharp, instantaneous kind that struck like lightning, and the quieter, more insidious kind that seeped into a person's bones until it hollowed them from within. And as the days passed, she realized she was living inside the second kind, drowning in a heaviness that grew heavier each time she glimpsed the strain etched into Adrian's face. She saw it in the way his steps slowed when he entered a room, in the tired set of his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking, in the faint but undeniable tremble of restraint when he tried to assure her that everything was fine. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But she could no longer pretend not to see the truth she feared most. Her presence in his life was costing him dearly. Every whisper, every rumor, every political slight had become a blade aimed not at her, but at him. And she could not allow herself to be the weapon used against the one man who had shown her more kindness than the world ever had. One evening, after overhearing yet another conversation among his advisers, voices dripping with disdain as they urged Adrian to distance himself from her, Celia fled to her room with a hand pressed hard against her mouth to keep from crying out. She paced the floor in frantic, uneven steps, her mind a storm of grief and guilt. For days she had watched Adrian fight battles on her behalf, battles he should never have been forced to fight, and she could no longer bear the thought of being the cause of his suffering. Tears blurred her vision as she sank onto the edge of her bed, whispering to herself that she had been foolish to believe she could rebuild a life beside a man like him, foolish to think she had a right to stand in his world when she had been cast out of her own. With trembling hands, she wrote him a letter, one that thanked him for his generosity and compassion, one that admitted she cared for him more deeply than she had ever dared to say, and one that begged him not to follow her. Each word tore a fresh wound in her heart, but she forced herself to continue, because love, true love, was not selfish. It did not cling when it endangered the person it cherished. Before dawn, she packed a small bag, careful not to wake anyone in the household, and slipped out of Ravenscar Manor with her aunt's quiet help, tears streaking down her cheeks as she climbed into the carriage waiting near the back entrance. The moment the horses began to move, a piece of her heart tore away so violently she pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to hold herself together. And miles away, in his private chambers, Adrian discovered the abandoned letter just as the first grey light of morning touched the windows. The moment he read her trembling words, her plea for him not to come after her, his entire world cracked open, the breath leaving his lungs in a sharp, ragged exhale as he realized she had done the one thing he could never allow. She had left him to protect him, and he would not, could not, let that be the end. Adrian was already halfway down the manor steps before the letter had fully slipped from his fingers, his pulse hammering with a violent urgency he had not felt since boyhood, the kind that stripped him of logic and left only instinct, raw, desperate, consuming. The storm that had been gathering all morning finally broke open in a torrent as he mounted his horse, rain pelting his face in sharp, needling bursts, but he barely felt it. All he could see was Celia's handwriting trembling across the page. All he could hear was the echo of her plea, "Do not follow me," a plea he shattered without hesitation because she did not understand, could not understand, that the moment she walked out of Ravenscar Manor, she had taken what remained of his restraint with her. He rode with reckless speed, mud and water splashing beneath the hooves of his horse as lightning split the sky in jagged veins of white. The world blurred into streaks of grey and storm, dark green, but he pushed harder, each gust of wind fueling the fierce, aching certainty that he could not lose her, not to fear, not to guilt, not to the memory of wounds that had never been her doing. Celia, huddled inside her small carriage several miles ahead, stared blankly out the rain, streaked window, each jolt of the wheels shaking her fragile resolve. She had pressed her forehead to the cool glass in an effort to quiet the storm inside her, but the ache in her chest only grew sharper, heavier, until tears once again blurred the shifting silhouettes of trees rushing past. She whispered Adrian's name into the darkness as though it were a prayer, her breath catching on a sob she could not swallow, but she forced herself to sit straighter, reminding herself again and again that she had done the right thing, that leaving him was the only way to protect the man she loved from the ruin she carried like a cursed shadow. Yet when thunder cracked overhead and the carriage lurched to a sudden halt, her breath froze in her throat. Outside, a familiar silhouette emerged through sheets of rain, tall, broad, shouldered, soaked to the bone, and moving toward her with a determination that shook the ground beneath her. Celia opened the carriage door with trembling hands, the wind tearing at her cloak as Adrian strode up to her, rainwater running down his face like the tracks of a man who had ridden through the end of the world to reach her. She choked on his name, but before she could speak more, he seized her shoulders, not harshly, but with a desperation that made her knees weaken, demanding to know why she would think he would ever let her go. His voice broke on the last word, ragged from the storm, and from something far more fragile. Celia tried to protest, tried to insist that she was saving him from further damage, but he shook his head, rain dripping from his lashes, declaring that the only thing destroying him was the thought of losing her. The storm roared around them, wind whipping their clothes and hair as though determined to drown out the truth that had been festering between them for months. And as she stared up at him, her heart thundering louder than the rain, Celia saw it, saw the fear, the longing, the love he had fought so fiercely to bury. Her lips parted, her breath trembling, and for the first time she allowed herself to hope that perhaps she had not been the burden she believed herself to be. For a long, suspended moment, the storm held them still, two souls shuddering on the edge of something neither could turn from, and Celia realized that she had not undone the life of a man who vowed never to wed. She had become the one person he was willing to break every vow to protect. Rain poured from the heavens as though the sky itself grieved with them, but Adrian barely felt the chill seeping through his soaked coat. All he could feel was Celia trembling beneath his hands. All he could hear was the frantic, uneven rhythm of her breath as she tried to look away from him, as though she feared that meeting his gaze would unravel the last of her resolve. He would not allow it, not tonight, not when she had fled believing she was saving him, not when she had carved her absence into him with the brutal precision of a wound he could not ignore. "You cannot," he said, voice roughened by rain and emotion. Ever believe that leaving me protects me? His words, fierce yet trembling with something undone, struck her harder than the cold wind. Celia shook her head, water streaming down her cheeks like tears the storm claimed as its own, insisting that she had brought him nothing but trouble, that every whispered insult, every political challenge, every resurgence of her scandal had been laid at his feet purely because he stood near her. Her voice cracked as she told him she could not bear to be the reason he lost allies, influence, or the respect he had spent a lifetime commanding. She begged him to see reason, begged him to let her go, not for her sake, but for his own. Adrian stepped closer, the rain pounding against his shoulders like a relentless drumbeat, and caught her face in his hands, forcing her gently yet unshakably to meet his eyes. "Celia," he whispered, her name splintering in his throat, "you are not my ruin." She trembled, lips parting in disbelief. "I am every burden you should never have carried." "No." His thumbs brushed rain, or tears, from her cheeks. "You are the only honest thing my life has known in years." She shook once, helplessly, her resolve fracturing beneath the tenderness in his voice. But Adrian wasn't finished. He stepped closer until their foreheads nearly touched, his breath warm against her lips as he confessed in a voice so raw it nearly broke her. "I was empty long before you. I had nothing to lose until you walked into my world." The words stole her breath. She clutched at his coat as though the storm itself might sweep her away if she didn't anchor herself to him. "But the rumors," she whispered, "the attacks, they mean to hurt you." Adrian's jaw flexed, a muscle ticking with a fury not directed at her, but at the world that dared make her believe she was a weapon rather than a woman. "Let them come," he said, each word resonating like a vow. "They have taken nothing from me that matters. But if I lose you, Celia, if you walk away again, there will be nothing left." Her breath hitched, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might shatter. Rain thundered around them, lightning flashing across the sky as though marking the moment with its fierce, blinding brilliance. Celia reached up with trembling fingers, touching his cheek with a gentleness that made him inhale sharply. "I am afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he admitted, raw honesty unshielded. And for a single moment, everything stilled, the storm, the world, the distance between them, as though the quiet acknowledgement of fear had drawn them closer than any declaration could. But neither stepped forward, and neither stepped back. They remained suspended in heartbreak and yearning, both knowing that something monumental had shifted, yet still unable to cross the final threshold that would bind them irrevocably to one another. The storm had barely passed when Adrian set the household into motion, with a resolve that crackled sharper than lightning, for the threat against Celia, her desperate flight, and the truth that had spilled from both their lips beneath the rain had hardened something in him into ruthless clarity. Ensfield would not touch her again, neither her name, nor her safety, nor even the faintest echo of her peace. At dawn he summoned his most trusted investigators, men who served the Ravenscar line with unwavering loyalty, and ordered them to tear apart every ledger, every correspondence, every whispered connection tied to Ensfield's dealings. Celia, exhausted from the night's emotional storm, sat at the edge of the great study, watching Adrian with a mixture of awe and fear, for she had never seen him like this, commanding not out of duty, but out of something fiercely personal, something that made each word he spoke carry the weight of a vow. Within hours the evidence began to take shape, puzzle pieces snapping into place with horrifying precision, land deeds signed by her father under false pretenses, payments routed through shell estates controlled by Ensfield, letters penned to associates boasting of his intention to seize the Ashford property and force Celia into compliance through reputation or ruin. Celia felt the blood drain from her face as she read the documents, her fingers tightening on the parchment until the edges crumpled. Her father, kind, trusting, earnest, had never realized he had been used as a pawn in the scheme that later swallowed his daughter whole. Adrian watched the anguish flicker across her expression and cursed the cruelty of a world that preyed on innocence, stepping closer with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside him. He took the papers from her shaking hands and told her, voice low and steady, that none of this was her fault, that Ensfield had crafted her downfall with deliberate malice long before she ever set foot in that damned ballroom. The room fell quiet around them as Celia absorbed the truth, the weight of relief and sorrow merging into something that tightened her throat until she could barely breathe. She whispered that she had spent months believing she had brought shame upon herself, believing she had deserved the whispers and stares. Adrian's gaze hardened with a fury she felt like heat against her skin, and he vowed, softly but with terrifying certainty, that Ensfield would answer for every wound he had inflicted. Together they stood over the table where the evidence lay arranged like a map of betrayal, the morning light casting long shadows across the papers. And in that moment, Celia felt something shift inside her, not just fear or grief, but resolve, sharp and steady. She was no longer a woman hiding from scandal. She was a woman standing beside the one man willing to burn down an entire system to defend her. Adrian, watching her shoulders straighten as she steadied her breath, realized with startling clarity that their fight was no longer merely about justice. It was about reclaiming a future Ensfield had tried to steal, a future Adrian now guarded with everything he was. The revelation of Ensfield's plot might have been enough to break Celia a second time, but fate, unyielding in its cruelty, had yet another truth waiting for her, one that settled over the study like a bitter fog, as Adrian's investigators brought forward an additional stack of documents sealed with the Ashford family crest. Celia reached for them with hesitant fingers, her breath shallow, her nerves raw from the morning's discoveries, and as she unfolded the first parchment, she felt the room tilt faintly beneath her feet. The ink was unmistakably her father's, his elegant hand, his careful flourishes, but the contents struck her like a blow. Preliminary agreements transferring partial rights of their bordering estate to a company Ensfield controlled, signed months before her father's unexpected illness, long before she herself understood the predatory sweetness with which Lord Ensfield had approached their family. Celia's vision blurred as she traced her father's signature, the memory of his gentle smile rising unbidden in her mind. He had believed he was securing a beneficial arrangement, a partnership that would ease their financial burdens, a step to safeguard her future. Instead, he had been deceived, manipulated into laying the very foundation of the trap that later destroyed her reputation. A strangled sound escaped her, half sob, half gasp, before she could silence it, and she staggered back a step, as though the parchment itself had burned her. Adrian was beside her instantly, steadying her elbow with a touch that was both protective and heartbreakingly tender, his thumb brushing soothing circles into her sleeve in a gesture he likely didn't realize he'd made. Celia shook her head in disbelief, her words stumbling out in fragments as she tried to reconcile the father she had worshipped with the signature before her. "He didn't know," she whispered, voice trembling. "He couldn't have known. He would never have agreed to anything that hurt me." Her aunt, who had been watching from the corner of the room, silent but supportive, stepped forward with tears shimmering in her eyes, confirming in a tremulous voice that Celia's father had worried for months over Ensfield's growing influence, but had died before understanding the breadth of the deception. The realization, grief tangled with a vicious relief, broke something within Celia. She sank into a nearby chair, pressing her hands to her face as tears slipped through her fingers, not of shame this time, but of a sorrow so deep it echoed through every piece of her. Adrian kneeled beside her, not the Duke of Ravenscar, not the fearsome figure Parliament cowered before, but simply a man aching to ease the pain etched into the woman before him. He took her hands gently, prying them from her face so he could look into her eyes, and the anguish he saw there nearly unraveled his carefully held restraint. He spoke softly, reverently, telling her that her father had been a victim, not a conspirator, that none of this rested on his conscience or hers, that Ensfield alone bore the weight of every wound inflicted. Celia leaned into him then, not from weakness, but from the profound relief of finally being allowed to mourn without blame. The moment stretched between them like a fragile, shimmering thread, their foreheads nearly touching, their breaths mingling, two souls cracked open by grief yet drawn together by the quiet, fierce promise that healing was no longer a burden either would carry alone. The decision to bring their evidence before the Crown Court was not made lightly, but by the time the morning of the hearing dawned, Adrian and Celia stood united with a certainty forged from every wound, every whispered cruelty, every truth laid bare in the ledger room. Celia dressed with trembling hands, her aunt fixing the last clasp on her gown, while whispering encouragement that barely pierced her spiraling nerves. She had spent months shrinking beneath the weight of her ruin. Now she was being asked to walk willingly into the very arena that had once devoured her. Yet as Adrian extended his hand to help her into the carriage, the steady warmth in his gaze steadied her heartbeat, a silent vow that she would not face this trial alone. The courtroom was a cavern of polished wood and judging eyes, filled with nobles who had once delighted in her downfall and now watched with thinly veiled curiosity as she entered at the Duke of Ravenscar's side. Ensfield sat at the opposing table, arrogance radiating off him like a foul scent, his smirk growing with every whisper rippling through the gallery. But when the proceedings began, the arrogance began to crack. Adrian presented the forged letters with a voice sharp as a drawn blade, his calm composure masking the fury simmering beneath each word. He laid out the false land agreements, the manipulated payments, the web of deceit Ensfield had spun around the Ashford family. Celia watched, breath held tight, as the court murmured in outrage, particularly when the damning correspondence surfaced, a letter in which Ensfield boasted to an associate that a woman's reputation is the easiest currency to break, especially when she is foolish enough to trust in her own virtue. Gasps erupted. Several ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths in horror. Celia's stomach churned as the words echoed through the chamber, yet she forced herself not to falter, lifting her chin with a quiet dignity that made Adrian's chest tighten with pride. When the judge called for her testimony, Celia rose on legs that trembled beneath her gown, but Adrian's subtle nod anchored her. She spoke clearly, recounting the night of the scandal, not with theatrics or bitterness, but with the steady honesty of a woman who had survived both malice and shame. Ensfield attempted to interrupt, only to be silenced by the judge's stern rebuke. As the evidence mounted, the structure of Ensfield's lies crumbled. Within hours, the verdict fell like a heavy stone. Ensfield was stripped of influence, fined, and charged with orchestrating a fraudulent scheme with intent to coerce and defraud. The final strike came when he was escorted from the courtroom, no longer the smug puppet master, but a cornered, disgraced man whose schemes had finally swallowed him whole. When Celia turned toward Adrian, she saw not triumph in his expression, but a fierce, overwhelming relief that left her breathless. And as they walked out of the courtroom together, the harsh sunlight spilling across their joined shadows, Celia realized that the war Ensfield had waged on her life was over, and she had not just survived it, she had defeated it, standing beside the one man who had fought every step with her. Victory, Celia soon discovered, carried its own peculiar ache, for although Ensfield's downfall had been swift, brutal, and undeniably public, the aftermath birthed a new kind of scrutiny, one gilded in flattery rather than disdain, yet no less suffocating, because the same society that had reveled in her ruin now clamored to reposition her as a symbol of resilience, redemption, and fashionable scandal triumphantly overturned. Invitations arrived in such floods that her aunt's parlor table vanished beneath mountains of embossed parchment, each card written with breathless enthusiasm by hosts who had once crossed her name from their guest lists without hesitation. Celia stared at them with a mixture of disbelief and nausea, for she could still hear the echoes of the ballroom whispers that had gutted her so completely, could still feel the weight of the stares that had pierced her reputation like a blade. She wanted no part of this newfound adoration, not when it was rooted in convenience rather than conscience, but appearances, as her aunt gently reminded her, were the currency of survival, and Celia could not reject the future she had fought so hard to reclaim. And so, with reluctance she barely managed to conceal, she attended several small gatherings, her posture straight, her smile gentle but distant. The same people who once stepped away from her now pressed near, eager to congratulate her, to remark upon her courage, to suggest she was an inspiration. Their praise rang hollow, and each compliment felt like a stone placed upon her chest. Adrian accompanied her when he could, his presence a shield more effective than any reputation she might one day rebuild. Yet even with him at her side, she felt the unease lurking beneath every glance cast their way. If she sensed admiration, she also sensed calculation. Men who now eyed her not as scandal but as opportunity. Women who whispered about her proximity to the elusive Duke of Ravenscar. Suitors who bowed too deeply or lingered too long with smiles that made her skin prickle. Celia laughed politely, said all the expected words, but she felt hollowed, her heart thrumming with something sharp each time she saw Adrian across a crowded room, standing tall, expression unreadable, gaze flickering to her with a longing he could not entirely hide. And he, watching her navigate the gilded battlefield of society with wary grace, felt a jealousy coiled tight within him at the sight of other men circling her, men who believed that victory in court had somehow made her free for the taking. He approached her more often than propriety required, offering a steadying hand, a quiet conversation, a shield against those who sought to claim what was not theirs. Celia felt her breath catch silently each time he drew close, her pulse racing with a mix of hope and fear. Because beneath the surface of this glittering acceptance, she understood a truth that haunted her. She no longer feared society's rejection, she feared losing Adrian in the shifting tide of it. And Adrian, with each lingering glance and each tightening of his jaw, realized a truth of his own, that the thought of any man winning her attention made his heart twist with a possessiveness he had never felt, a possessiveness that told him he could no longer pretend indifference. Not when she had become the center of every breath he took. By the time the Harrington soirée arrived, a gathering so lavishly anticipated that even seasoned members of the Ton treated it as a landmark of the season, Adrian was taut with an emotion he refused to name, an emotion that sharpened each time he imagined Celia entering a room filled with men who now fancied themselves worthy of her attention. He arrived early, pacing the periphery of the ballroom with a tension that unsettled even his closest allies. But when Celia finally stepped through the arched entrance, wearing a soft silver gown that shimmered with every movement and carried an air of quiet grace no scandal had ever truly dimmed, the breath left his lungs in a slow, unsteady exhale. She looked radiant, yes, but she also looked unbearably vulnerable amidst the throng of hungry eyes that turned toward her. As she made her way into the room, a gentleman, young, fashionable, and clearly ambitious, approached her far too eagerly, bowing with theatrical admiration and showering her with compliments that dripped with polished charm. Celia smiled politely, but the discomfort beneath that smile was unmistakable to Adrian, whose jaw clenched with a force that startled even him. The man leaned in closer, saying something that made Celia's expression falter ever so slightly, and in that instant Adrian's restraint snapped. He crossed the ballroom in long, deliberate strides, every inch of him radiating quiet authority as he stepped between Celia and the man with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. The suitor stammered, startled, retreating under Adrian's icy stare, and Celia felt her breath catch as the Duke turned to her, his eyes storm, dark, his expression troubled by an intensity that made her pulse stutter. "You look distressed," he said softly, almost too softly, as though the words themselves cost him something to speak. Celia shook her head, whispering that she was fine, but the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. He stepped closer, his presence shielding her from the prying glances around them, and for a moment neither spoke, the air thick with all the emotions they had swallowed for far too long. Then, in a low voice meant only for her, Adrian confessed that watching other men approach her had become unbearable, an admission that stunned Celia into stillness. He continued, each word raw and trembling, saying he had tried to hold himself back, tried to keep their connection contained within the fragile boundaries they had drawn, but every moment he spent near her only deepened what he felt. Celia's heart fluttered painfully, torn between hope and the fear that his words were born from gratitude, from obligation, from everything except true, unbidden affection. She quietly asked him that very question, whether his confession came from genuine feeling or from the pressure of having defended her before society. Adrian froze, the breath leaving him in a visible shudder, for her doubt cut deeper than any political strike. He lifted her hand with trembling reverence, his thumb brushing across her knuckles as he whispered that no amount of obligation could ever explain the way she had unmade every rule he lived by, the way her strength had undone him piece by piece, the way he found himself thinking of her at every hour. But before he could finish, before the words that hovered so precariously between them could fall, footsteps echoed nearby, breaking the fragile stillness as a cluster of guests approached. Their spell shattered, Celia withdrew her hand as though burned, her eyes shimmering with uncertainty. Adrian stepped back, though every inch of him seemed carved with the ache of everything left unsaid, and Celia felt her heart trembling beneath her ribs, knowing they stood on the edge of something monumental, yet still trapped in the space between desire and fear. The Harrington soirée stretched on with unbearable slowness, each moment tightening the invisible thread between Celia and Adrian until it felt ready to snap beneath the weight of everything they had not been able to say. Celia tried to lose herself among the gilded decorations and swirling dancers, but every sound seemed distant, every face blurred at the edges, as though the entire ballroom existed only as a shimmering veil, standing between her and the man whose unfinished confession had lodged itself in her chest like a heartbeat out of rhythm. She drifted to the periphery of the room, seeking a breath of air, but before she could reach the terrace, A familiar voice cut through the din, Lady Whitcomb, whose tongue was as sharp as ever, calling Celia's name with the falsely warm lilt of a woman accustomed to orchestrating social scenes. Celia turned, schooling her expression with careful calm, only to find herself surrounded by a cluster of women whose smiles were too wide, too sweet, too calculated. They showered her with praise, remarked on her miraculous return, marveled at her transformation from tragic figure to admired heroine. Yet beneath every compliment, Celia felt the thin sting of judgment, the quiet delight in her discomfort. When one of them asked, far too casually, whether the Duke of Ravenscar's attentions had been helpful in her recovery, Celia felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not from shame but from an anger so unexpected it stole her breath. She answered with quiet dignity, stating that the Duke had shown her kindness, nothing more, but the women exchanged knowing looks that made her stomach twist. Before she could escape, a gentleman approached, one of Adrian's political adversaries masked behind a thin veneer of charm, and with a bow far too deep, he took her hand and asked her to dance. Celia refused politely, but the man persisted, his grip tightening in a manner that sent a ripple of fear through her. At that moment, the entire atmosphere shifted. She felt it before she saw him. Adrian appeared beside her, like a gathering storm, his expression carved with cold fury as he placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder and informed him that Lady Ashford was not dancing this evening. The gentleman attempted a smug retort, but one look at Adrian's eyes, dark, molten, dangerous, silenced him completely. He released Celia and retreated with a pale, stiff bow. When the crowd thinned again, Adrian turned to her, his voice low, asking if she was hurt. Celia shook her head, but her breath trembled, and the sight of it nearly undid him. He led her to a quieter corner behind a pillar draped in winter roses, the ballroom's glittering chaos muffled behind them. There, away from the hungry eyes of society, he tried again, tried to finish the confession the night had torn from him earlier. But before the words could fully leave his lips, Lord Harrington himself approached with an urgent request for the Duke's attention on a matter of state. Adrian's jaw clenched in visible frustration, torn between duty and the woman who had claimed his heart without meaning to. Celia whispered that he must go. He whispered that he would return for her. But as he stepped away, both knew the fragile moment they kept chasing had slipped through their fingers once more, leaving them suspended in the aching silence of a love that refused to be spoken but could no longer be hidden. Adrian spent the rest of the evening locked in Lord Harrington's study, surrounded by maps and advisers and matters of state that demanded his full attention. Yet for the first time in his life, his mind refused to bend to duty. Every word spoken around him sounded distant, muffled by the memory of Celia's trembling breath behind the pillar, the flash of fear in her eyes when that man had gripped her hand, and the quiet strength she had shown despite the cruelty swirling around them. He dismissed strategy after strategy with clipped precision, but impatience throbbed beneath his skin, his pulse beating to a rhythm that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the woman waiting alone in a ballroom filled with wolves. By the time he finally escaped the Council of Lords, his composure hung by a thread. He found Celia near the terrace, bathed in the soft glow of lantern light as she stood alone by a marble railing, her eyes lifted toward the night sky as though searching for something she no longer believed she deserved. The sight of her, fragile yet enduring, luminous yet weary, cracked something open inside him so fully he felt breathless. She turned when she felt him approach, her expression softening with relief, but before she could form a word, he closed the distance between them with a swiftness that startled even him. He took her hands in his grip firm and warm, and Celia's heart lurched at the intensity in his gaze, raw, unguarded, trembling at the edges, as if holding back the tide of everything he had ever sworn not to feel. "Celia," he said, her name breaking in his throat in a way she had never heard before. "I cannot, God help me, I cannot watch you walk through another room alone while men circle you like carrion birds. I cannot watch you shrink beneath their whispers. I cannot bear the thought that you believe yourself unwanted, unloved, unworthy." She stared at him, breath frozen, her lips parting on a soft sound of disbelief. "Adrian, you must not say things you will regret when the night has passed." He shook his head with strained conviction, stepping closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. "I regret only the time I have wasted trying not to feel this." Celia's heart pounded so hard she thought it might fracture, but fear twisted through her hope like a shadow. "Do not pity me," she whispered, terrified of becoming a charity project carved into the shape of affection. "This is not pity," he said, his voice trembling with a depth she had never imagined he possessed. This is the moment I realized that the fear I felt when you left me in the rain was not fear of losing control, it was fear of losing you." A soft gasp escaped her. Lantern light flickered across them, stirring gold into his dark eyes. And then, without warning, without hesitation, without breath left to doubt himself, he said the words that unraveled her world. "Marry me." The night stilled around them. Celia swayed, the earth tilting beneath her feet, her heart thundering with equal parts yearning and terror. His hands tightened on hers, not demanding but pleading, anchoring, trembling with the force of a confession he could no longer contain. "Celia," he whispered again, voice scarcely steady, "choose me, and I will spend my life proving that you were never ruin, you were my salvation." She inhaled sharply, her vision blurring, her answer forming on her lips, when sudden footsteps and a sharp cry from the doorway shattered the moment, yanking both of them back into the merciless reality waiting to claim them. The sharp cry that sliced through the air struck Celia like a blow, freezing the unfinished word on her lips as she and Adrian turned in unison toward the ballroom's arched doorway. Lady Montgomery, she of the razor, edged tongue and tireless devotion to gossip, stood rigid at the threshold, one gloved hand pressed theatrically to her chest, eyes wide with scandalized delight as she took in the tableau before her. The Duke of Ravenscar standing far too close to the woman whose reputation had only just clawed its way back from the ashes. The lantern light painted their intertwined hands in damning warmth, and within seconds the ripple of murmurs spread through the gathering crowd behind Lady Montgomery like wildfire leaping from tree to tree. Celia felt her heart plummet, her breath shatter, her entire body trembling as voices rose in shocked exclamations, some appalled, some gleeful, all dangerous. Adrian's grip tightened around her fingers, but she pulled back instinctively, terror surging through her with such force it nearly knocked her off balance. "No, Adrian," she whispered, shaking her head as the walls of the terrace seemed to close in around her. "Not like this. If they think you offered for me in a moment of impropriety, they will say I trapped you. They will say you had no choice." Already, several lords whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes sharp with opportunity, while a group of young women pressed forward to hear every detail, their expressions caught between envy and hunger for the next scandal. Adrian stepped in front of Celia, shielding her from the encroaching stares, his posture straight and imposing, his jaw set with a fury barely leashed. But Celia saw the truth in the tilt of his shoulders. The irritation, yes, but also the injury. He wanted to fight for her publicly. He wanted to stand before the world and declare himself, and yet she knew the danger of a story asked for too soon. Society would twist it, Ensfield's remnants would weaponize it, and everything they had sacrificed for vindication could be undone in a single breath. "Cease this at once," Adrian commanded the onlookers, his voice cutting through the night like steel, but the crowd only pressed closer, their whispers growing more frenzied. Celia felt the humiliation of her past threaten to swallow her whole once more. The walls blurred, the scent of roses soured into memory, and her pulse throbbed in her ears with the sickening familiarity of a night long ago when she had been surrounded, judged, devoured. Adrian sensed her spiraling and reached for her, but she stepped back, whispering, "I cannot be the ruin they make of us. I cannot let that happen to you." Her retreat drew a cruel murmur from the crowd, someone suggesting she was manipulating sympathy, another implying her refusal was a calculated ploy. Adrian snapped, turning on them with a fury so cold the whispers stuttered to silence. But the damage had already taken shape, a new scandal forming in real time. Before he could pull her back to him, Celia fled, darting through the terrace archway, skirts brushing marble as she disappeared into the shadows of the outer halls, her breath breaking, her heart in tatters, convinced that she had destroyed the one moment she had prayed for. And behind her, as the crowd's speculation swelled into a fevered hum, Adrian closed his eyes, knowing with sick certainty that the next hours would decide everything, her future, his honor, and whether love could survive the fire society had lit at their feet. Adrian did not remember moving. It was as though his body had acted before his mind could form a single coherent thought. But within moments of Celia's flight he was striding through the gilded corridors of Harrington House, the chaotic hum of speculation swelling behind him like a storm he refused to let swallow her again. Servants skittered out of his path as he cut through the grand foyer, his boots echoing sharply across marble, his breath tight with a fear that no battlefield or political clash had ever conjured in him. He found her at last in a quiet vestibule, collapsed against a column half, hidden in shadow, her arms wrapped around herself as though trying to hold together the pieces of a heart she feared she had shattered beyond repair. When she heard his footsteps, she flinched, shrinking inward with a pain that sliced him deeper than any accusation ever could. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice breaking in a way that cleaved him open, "I have ruined everything. They will twist this. They will twist you. I cannot be the cause of your downfall." But he shook his head, something fierce and certain flashing in his eyes as he stepped toward her, refusing to let her retreat again. "Celia, the only ruin would be letting that crowd decide our future while we stand here in fear." She tried to turn away, but he captured her trembling hands, lifting them to his chest and pressing them over the frantic beat of his heart. "Do you feel that? It has never beaten like this for anything except you." Her breath trembled, her tears shimmering in the dim light, but the terror remained, a deep, rooted fear carved from every wound society had inflicted upon her. "They will never accept me," she whispered. "Tonight proved that. They see only scandal. They will never see me as worthy of you." Adrian's jaw clenched with a resolve that shook through his entire frame. "Then let them hear it from me. Let them hear it in a way that no rumor, no gossip, no scheming lord can ever twist." Before she could fully grasp his meaning, he pulled her gently but firmly back toward the ballroom, his grip unwavering despite her soft protests. The crowd turned as he entered, their whispers flaring like sparks as they saw Celia at his side. The music stuttered to a halt. Every gaze snapped toward them, curiosity, disdain, shock, all swirling like a tempest waiting to devour. Adrian lifted his chin, his posture radiating the authority of a man who had cowed Parliament and toppled political titans, but never, not once, had he spoken with the vulnerability that now softened the edges of his command. He raised his voice enough for the entire ballroom to hear, each word echoing with steel and startling emotion. "Let there be no misunderstanding. What you witnessed on the terrace was not scandal, it was mine." Silence rippled out like a wave. "I asked Lady Celia Ashford to be my wife." Gasps exploded through the room, fans snapped open, a few lords paled visibly. Adrian tightened his hold on her hand, grounding her as much as himself. "And I will not retract it," he continued, eyes sweeping the assembly in a challenge so powerful it felt like a warning carved in stone. "Not because of gossip, not because of appearances, and certainly not because society once failed to recognize her worth." Celia's heart thundered so hard she felt dizzy, her breath catching as she looked up into the face of the man who had just risked everything, reputation, power, legacy, to pull her out of the shadows she had been forced into. But before she could speak, before the world could hear her answer, a voice rang out from the back of the room, angry, booming, unmistakably familiar, and as the crowd parted with horrified fascination, the figure who stepped forward threatened to overturn everything Adrian had just dared to claim. The crowd parted like water before a ship's bow as the intruder strode forward, Lord Montgomery himself, husband to the sharp-tongued lady who had first sounded the alarm, his face flushed with anger and opportunistic outrage. His voice boomed across the ballroom, carrying that theatrical righteousness only a man certain of his own power could wield, as he demanded to know whether Adrian had taken leave of his senses, whether the Duke of Ravenscar truly intended to bind the dignity of his title to a woman whose history had already shamed the peerage once. The words cracked through the ballroom like a lash, and Celia felt them physically, tightening around her ribs until she could scarcely breathe. Adrian's expression darkened to something carved from iron, but Celia placed a trembling hand on his arm before he could respond, her voice barely a whisper as she begged him not to ignite another public conflict on her behalf. Yet Adrian only covered her hand with his own, the gesture small but fiercely protective as he stepped slightly in front of her, as though he would take every wound before allowing another to brush against her skin. "Lord Montgomery," Adrian said with a calm so lethal the older man stiffened, "if you are wise, you will choose your next words carefully." But Montgomery, intoxicated by attention, pushed forward, spewing self-righteous claims about propriety and the sanctity of noble reputations, about how a duke could not possibly marry a woman tainted by scandal, no matter the theatrics of the courtroom. Murmurs surged again, shocked, delighted, venomous, and Celia felt her knees threaten to give despite Adrian's steady grasp. Then, something inside her shifted. Perhaps it was exhaustion from months of humiliation. Perhaps it was the fierce vulnerability in Adrian's eyes as he turned to her. Or perhaps it was the realization that this was the moment she had been running from, fearing, grasping for without knowing. She stepped forward before Adrian could stop her, her voice clear though her body trembled, addressing Montgomery with a quiet strength that cut through the noise like a bell. "My lord," she said, "if my name brings shame upon anyone here tonight, it is only because men like you helped paint it so." A stunned silence rippled outward. What happened to me was done to me, and what happened today, my vindication, was earned through courage, not through the cruel delight you take in clinging to the remnants of a lie. Montgomery sputtered, taken aback, but Celia lifted her chin. "If you wish to speak of dignity, then perhaps begin by showing some." For a heartbeat the ballroom held its breath, then Adrian stepped to her side, pride blazing in his eyes with such intensity it stole her breath. He faced Montgomery fully now, voice ringing with quiet, devastating authority. "You speak of titles, I speak of worth, and there is no one in this room," his gaze swept the assembly, "whose worth equals hers." Gasps, soft but awed, fluttered at the edges of the crowd. Adrian turned to Celia, taking both her hands in his voice trembling for the first time before the world. "You asked earlier whether my offer came from obligation." His breath hitched. "Celia, there is no force on this earth strong enough to compel me toward a future I did not choose." He sank to one knee, not in spectacle, not in dominance, but in reverent sincerity before the woman who had undone every wall he once believed unbreakable. "Marry me," he whispered, "because I cannot face a world where you walk through it without me." Tears rose, warm and unstoppable, as Celia gazed down at him, at the Duke who had risked his name, his power, his very heart in front of those who would have once devoured her. And with a steady breath, she lifted his hands to her lips and answered in a voice shaped by love and survival. "Yes." A sound rose from the crowd, not outrage this time, but a swell of something resembling hope, respect, perhaps even redemption. Adrian stood, drawing her into his arms with a tenderness that silenced every lingering whisper, and in the candlelit hush that followed, Celia felt the weight of her past fall away. Together they stepped into a future not shaped by scandal or fear, but by a vow strong enough to silence a kingdom and a love fierce enough to rewrite everything she had once believed she had lost.